Hi, and welcome back to Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy for part one of our lesson on Reconstruction, the post-Civil War. In a previous lesson, way back when, we learned about the concept of sectionalism that divided the North and South, with Southern states mostly favoring states' rights over a strong central or national government. We also learned how much the South was destroyed during the Civil War, leaving the region decimated. And today we will learn about Reconstruction. The Southern way of life was completely destroyed, both physically and socially, during the Civil War, which is sometimes referred to as the Second Revolution. Reconstruction was the Norse attempt to rebuild the Southern economy and society in a way that matched their ideals. Reconstruction was both a process and an era, and part of this complex procedure included the rebuilding and the transformation of the South, and the attempted integration and protection of the freed slaves. 4 million newly freed slaves were entering society after 250 years of slavery, and their status was very contentious. The southern states, again, much of which was destroyed by the war, had been built economically around the large production of cash crops, utilizing slave labor, and it had to be brought back into the United States following their devastating loss. So when was Reconstruction? Well, most historians use the dates of 1865 with the end of the Civil War to 1877 with the withdrawal of federal troops to delineate the period of Reconstruction. However, there are those that would argue that it lasted until the civil rights era of the 1960s, and some would say it continues to this day. So what do you need to know about Reconstruction? Some of the major themes we will cover are the attempts of Congress to protect the rights of the freed slaves with legislation and amendments, and how a reluctant and often hostile South would attempt to block this encroachment on their way of life and return things to as close to pre-war South as possible. And just a reminder, teachers, that this PowerPoint with a wide variety of materials are available at Teachers Pay Teachers. Just click the link in the notes below this video or search for Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy. We left off in our last lesson with the end of the Civil War and Congress passing the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. However, the process of Reconstruction had begun while the Civil War was still being fought. In his 1863 Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction, Lincoln had proposed a plan of readmitting Confederate states if 10% of their voters swore a loyalty oath to the Union, and he was prepared to pardon former Confederates if they took the oath and promised to eliminate slavery. We spoke of Lincoln's call to reunify the nation without punishing the South during his second inaugural address, with, quote, malice toward none and charity for all. However, Lincoln's 10% plan seemed way too lenient to many congressional, especially radical, Republicans. Congress passed a much harsher plan called the Wade-Davis Bill in 1864, requiring 50% of Southern state voters to take the oath of loyalty, and forbid any active members or supporters of the Confederacy from creating new state constitutions. So we see these differing opinions about treatment of the South between Congress and the president from the very beginning. Lincoln, favoring a more lenient approach, pocket vetoed the bill, just letting it die as the congressional session ended. Unfortunately, we will never know what path Lincoln would have ultimately followed during Reconstruction, as he was killed before it could start in earnest. With Lincoln's death, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat from Tennessee who had remained loyal to the Union and had been put on the ticket in 1864 as a sign of unity. Johnson blamed the Civil War on the rich planter slave-owning elite and had opposed secession. He promised a continuation of Lincoln's path for Reconstruction, keeping his 10% plan. From 1865 to 1867 is the period known as Presidential Reconstruction. And there's two periods you're going to need to know for your test. At first, some radical Republicans were optimistic that Johnson might be tougher on the Confederates than Lincoln, as he took away the right to vote from former Confederate leaders and wealthy planters with assets of more than $250,000. However, Republicans soon realized how wrong they were, as Johnson quickly began pardoning much of the old Confederate elite. While Johnson reluctantly required the Southern states to ratify the 13th Amendment before readmission, he favored a quick restoration of the Southern states into the Union. While he had been against slavery, he still held racist views, offering no protection for the rights of the former slaves. Johnson called for the creation of provisional governments, and congressional Republicans were outraged when many of these were made up of prominent Confederates. The Southern states also elected Confederate leaders, such as Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, to the U.S. Congress. As Congress adjourned for the election of 1866, the Southern states implemented what were known as the Black Codes. The Black Codes were a series of laws throughout the South designed to restrict the rights of the freedmen. Many required blacks to obtain passes to travel and blocked them from owning or renting land, often forcing many blacks to work on their old plantations, where they were forced to sign labor contracts. Under this system, the freed slaves were unable to vote or serve on juries, and many states implemented what were called vagrancy laws, in which freedmen would be arrested for trumped-up charges and leased out as farm labor. States often took their old slave laws and replaced the word slave for Negro. In essence, life for African Americans was almost exactly as it had been under slavery. Increasingly the victims of violence, freed slaves often turned to the Freedmen's Bureau, an agency created to provide aid, schools, and the power to deal with conflicts between freed slaves and their new employers. The Freedmen's Bureau, though, often struggled with funding and a hostile Southern population, as well as the reluctance by the federal government to give it the support it needed. Its greatest success was providing an education to the freed slaves, something that was very important to them, as for the most part it had been forbidden under slavery. Beyond an education, what freed slaves wanted more than anything else was land to farm. Inspired by an order General Sherman had given known as Field Order 15, calling for the confiscation of Confederate land and providing freedmen with, quote, 40 acres and a mule. The freed slaves felt entitled to the land that they had worked for generations. While a tiny percentage of freedmen were given confiscated land, this promise was largely left unfulfilled. What mostly developed was a system known as sharecropping, in which African Americans would lease land in exchange for giving the landowner a percentage of their crop. The landowner would also deduct expenses such as housing and farming supplies. This system usually left the former slaves in a state of continuous debt, as the owners would deduct more in expenses than the tenant would earn off the sale of their crop. Sharecropping would keep former slaves and many poor whites living in a state of massive poverty for generations. As the post-Civil War looked more and more like the pre-war South, Americans went to the polls to vote. Republicans resorted to what was called, quote-unquote, waving the bloody shirt, evoking their losses in the Civil War as a call for action. Outraged by the Black Codes and Johnson's leniency toward the South, moderate and radical Republicans swept congressional elections, gaining more than a two-thirds majority in both houses of Congress. What followed is known as Congressional Reconstruction, and this was led by radical Republicans such as Pennsylvania's Thaddeus Stevens and Massachusetts' Charles Sumner. Now holding a two-thirds majority, Congress was determined to protect the rights of the newly freed slaves that had been largely abused by the Black Codes. They passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, aimed at destroying the Black Codes by giving African Americans full citizenship. Johnson vetoed the bill, to which Republicans quickly overturned his veto with a two-thirds vote. Worried that future Congresses might overturn their bill, the Republicans proposed the 14th Amendment to make the protection of civil rights more permanent. The 14th Amendment defined and established the freed slaves as citizens, overturning the Dred Scott decision. It established that state laws could not deny the protection of the Bill of Rights to its citizens. It provides due process and equal protection under the law, a clause that is still used in cases today by anyone who feels that they are being legally discriminated against. Finally, the 14th Amendment blocked Confederate officers from holding state or federal office and the possibility of losing proportional representation in the U.S. Congress if African Americans were denied the right to vote. In 1867, Congress passed the Military Reconstruction Act, dividing the South into 5 districts to be governed by Union generals. It required the states to ratify the 14th Amendment and provide for male suffrage, or the right to vote, before being admitted back into the Union. This act essentially left the South under a state of martial law. It also abolished all the state governments that had been created under Lincoln and Johnson's 10% plan. Again, Johnson vetoed the act, and again, his veto was overridden by Congress. At this point, Congress was fed up with Johnson. Johnson's cabinet, made up of mostly Lincoln holdovers, were turning on him as well. In response, Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act, making it illegal for the president to fire a federal appointee without congressional approval. When Johnson fired Lincoln's Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, the House of Representatives promptly brought impeachment charges against him. This was the first time an acting president had been brought up on impeachment charges, and only one of 2 times in U.S. history it's been done. After being impeached by the House, the Senate came 1 vote short of the 2/3 required to convict him. However, the writing was on the wall for Johnson, and he served out the remainder of his term as a lame duck. And that's where we will pick up next time. But before we do, let's review. What was Lincoln's plan for readmitting the states known as the 10% plan? What did the Wade-Davis bill require? 50% of voters to take a loyalty oath. What are the 2 periods of Reconstruction known as? Presidential and Congressional Reconstruction. What angered congressional Republicans about Johnson? Well, there was a lot, but 2 of the big things were the quick pardoning and the leniency on the South and the Confederates, and failing to protect the rights of the freed slaves. What were the series of laws meant to keep African Americans in a semi-state of slavery after the war called? The Black Codes. This agency was established to provide aid for the freed slaves, the Freedmen's Bureau. What was the Freedmen's Bureau's greatest success? Education. Freed slaves were often stuck in this system in which a tenant uses the land in return for a share of the crops. Kind of just gave it away. It's called sharecropping. What was the purpose of the Civil Rights Act of 1866? Well, it was to protect the rights of the freed slaves, but also by making them citizens. To make the protection of the right of citizenship more permanent, Congress passed the 14th Amendment. What other protections does the 14th Amendment provide? Well, it says that states must incorporate the Bill of Rights. States must also allow for equal protection under the law and due process of all of its citizens, and it limited the political role of ex-Confederates. What did the Military Reconstruction Act do? It divided the South into 5 military districts. It said that they must ratify the 14th Amendment, provide male suffrage, and then they would be readmitted into the Union. What law did Congress use to bring impeachment charges against Johnson? The Tenure of Office Act. Johnson avoided impeachment by how many votes? 1. And that's it. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe, because up next we're going to look at Reconstruction Part 2 with ugly things like the KKK and the end of Reconstruction and whether Reconstruction was a success or a failure. And just a reminder, teachers, at this PowerPoint with worksheets, guided notes, quizzes, Kahoots, lesson plans, and additional activities are available at Teachers Pay Teachers. Just click the link in the notes below this video or search for Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy at Teachers Pay Teachers. Again, guys, thanks for watching.